In this gospel, Jesus reveals certain things about the afterlife to Mary in very Gnostic kinds of terms.
The afterlife in the four traditional Gospels is described as a blissful paradise. But in the Gospel of Mary, the afterlife involves a strange journey of the soul after death, in which the dead person encounters angelic and demonic beings as the soul makes its way to heaven. It is only to Mary that Jesus reveals this secret journey of the soul. The Gospel reports that Peter, the leader of the apostles, reacts explosively to this revelation. Peter says, "Did he really speak with a woman without our knowledge? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us?" In the Gospel, the apostles override Peter's denunciation and support Mary, saying, "If the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her?"
What is significant is that there was a spiritual kind of bond, that Mary was thought to be a person of insight, a leader, somebody who had an ability to motivate others, and that was her real gift. She understood the mind of Jesus and was able to communicate that. This is a gospel that gives a very different kind of view of what the message of Jesus is, and gives Mary Magdalene as the one who understands that point of view in a way that the other disciples did not.
But is this text a real gospel? The eyewitness account of Mary Magdalene? If so, it might change Christian history and revolutionize the role of women in the Christian church. The key lies in the Gospel's age. Is it older than the four traditional Gospels? And could it have been written by Mary Magdalene herself? The Gospel of Mary was first discovered in 1896 in Akhmin, Egypt. Carbon dating reveals this text was hand-copied in the 5th century. But over the years, fragments of the Gospel of Mary have emerged elsewhere in Egypt, and they are much older. New breakthroughs in technology can help refine the exact date of even the smallest fragments of ancient text. Using the 3D microscope allows scientists to focus on the details that provide clues to its age. At this level of detail, a modern sample of papyrus bears no resemblance to an ancient text.
If this were 2,000 years old, the surface would not be so shiny. It would be more matte because fibers would be worn and creating a sort of a nap to the surface, almost like suede.
Tests like these help provide a very precise date for the oldest fragments of the Gospel of Mary. They were written approximately 200 AD. The language and vocabulary also suggest that the Gospel of Mary was written during the 2nd century and not during the time of Jesus. Thus, it is highly unlikely that Mary Magdalene wrote the Gospel that bears her name. Most scholars believe it was created by a Gnostic Christian during the 2nd century, who wanted to invoke the authority of the female apostle.
We don't know who the author was, but many would imagine that there really is a woman's voice and a woman's perspective that is to be seen here. And it may be the case that finally there is a voice that is heard that is stifled in the other Gospels.
Perhaps more importantly, the Gospel of Mary reveals a power struggle in the early church about the role of women.
The whole idea of leadership of women is, I think, a very exciting thing to look at in this early Christian history. And the Gospel of Mary is a kind of a testimony to that.
The fact that Mary is a leader and a woman is a revolutionary concept in the early church.
The fact that there can be a Gospel of Mary indicates something of the fact that there were, in fact, folks like the Gnostics who are much more open to the inclusion of women as full members of the community. In fact, some of the people in the emerging Orthodox Church complained about this. I mean, there are some women that are administering the sacraments. There are women that are ordained among these Gnostics. Shame on them. The Gnostics saw no shame in that. And so for there to be a text like a Gospel of Mary is perfectly in line with a Gnostic point of view.
If the Gospel of Mary reveals the Gnostics' view on women, another Gnostic Gospel claims to present the account of Peter, head of the apostles, and it is said to reveal the secret about what really happened at the resurrection of Jesus. In 1886, French archaeologists working in Egypt uncovered an ancient Christian tomb with an extraordinary treasure. Clutched in the hands of an 8th century monk was a book called the Gospel of Peter. It was one of the first lost Gospels ever discovered. Could this be an actual lost account of the life of Jesus, written by Simon Peter, the hand-picked leader of the apostles? If so, it would change the history of Christianity, for the Gospel of Peter tells a very different version of the life of Jesus.
What we have is very precious and very exciting. It's an early story, but an alternative story.
In the Gospel of Peter, the Romans are surprisingly sympathetic. It says Jesus suffered no pain on the cross. But the most shocking difference, the Gospel of Peter claims to reveal an eyewitness account of the resurrection itself.
It is the only gospel that we have that attempts to tell the story of what happened during the resurrection. All the biblical gospels talk about the results of resurrection, that the tomb was empty, but they don't try and talk about the moment of resurrection per se.
The description begins on the 3rd morning after the death of Jesus, as Roman soldiers guard the tomb of the fallen Messiah. The Gospel of Peter says, the tomb was opened, and those soldiers saw it, for they were keeping guard. And as they were explaining what they had seen, they saw 3 men emerge from the tomb.
When they come out, they are supporting a third, supposedly Jesus, and then a deep voice comes and says, have you then preached to those who have died?
The resurrection ends with Jesus and the other figures rising into the sky, leaving the eyewitnesses to stare in wonder. The Gospel ends with a line claiming that it is the eyewitness account of Peter the Apostle himself. Could this book really be the work of the lead apostle, the first pope? Was it written at the same time or earlier than the 4 traditional Gospels? Or was it a later account, a forgery passing itself off as the eyewitness testimony of Peter? The archaeological evidence is unclear. The Gospel found in 1886 was dated from around 700 AD, 7 centuries after the death of Peter. Fragments have turned up in other sites from approximately 500 AD, still too late to have come directly from the apostle.
We're gonna have a wonderful time mosaicing these things. Thank God I'm not gonna have to do it.
But the Gospel was mentioned by early Christian writers. One bishop in what is now Turkey mentioned the book by name around 190 AD. We can trace the Gospel back to the 2nd century, but no further.
In all likelihood, this is a early 2nd century text. The reason we think it's an early 2nd century text is because it uses material from all the 4 extant Gospels that we have.
The stories in the Gospel of Peter are so similar to other Gospels that it seems likely they were simply copied. Whoever wrote this Gospel in the 2nd century claimed it was the work of Peter the Apostle to give it added authority. It was a common technique in the ancient world.
When some people wanted to communicate some idea that they felt was true or important for the early Christian movement to hear, they wouldn't say it in their own voice, but they would say it in the voice of someone who they understood to have authority.
In that sense, the Gospel of Peter was not a real account, but a forgery. But that brings up a point that is important and disturbing. If the Gospel of Peter is a forgery, then the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are also forgeries.
We don't know who those authors were, but they were written in the name of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, because these were the great folks of the past. The fact of the matter is, they almost certainly were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Most scholars agree that even the four traditional Gospels were not written by the apostles for whom they are named, but by followers of those apostles. If the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not in fact written by the apostles, then does that mean that the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Mary may be considered just as authentic? The answer is still unclear to historians. But there are elements in the Gospel of Peter that suggest it is not an eyewitness account by anyone, much less Peter the Apostle. The tale it tells contains highly suspect material. In the resurrection scene, Jesus and the two angelic beings are said to stretch up beyond the clouds. And behind Jesus in the tomb emerges the actual cross, which speaks.